Okay, calm down.
Well, another thing that Israel opposes, besides Palestinian statehood, which they make very clear, is BDS, boycott, divest, sanction. Can you talk about how the state of Israel, the government of Israel, and its various ministries have combated BDS?
Yeah, this is a really great question, and I appreciate it. I think one thing as we start to understand this that's important for us to grasp is that the state of Israel had actually become quite comfortable fighting armed resistance or terrorism or whatever one wants to call it. The challenge that they had was, as one Israeli general said, "We don't do Gandhi well." What do I mean by that? It's easy for Israel to claim sort of legitimacy for its policies when it can demonstrate that it's under security threat. And of course, that's much easier to do when the challenge is coming in the form of arms. But when it's coming in the form of nonviolent dissent, which is what boycotts, divestment, and sanctions are, it's a lot harder to defend Israel's policies. And so they came to realize this over time and decided that they needed different approaches to deal with dissent in global civil society around Israel's policies. And they did this in a number of different ways. They tried to do it through sort of propaganda and investment in sort of the Israeli foreign ministry to try to bring people to Israel and send them on propaganda tours and what have you. But then, in the early 2010s, they sort of started to realize that that wasn't working. That trying to defend Israel's policies against nonviolent dissent wasn't effective because it's hard to sell apartheid in the 21st century. And so they decided, instead of trying to defend their policies, they needed to go on the attack against dissenters. And this was a conscious Israeli government decision that became enacted through the establishment of something called the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs in 2015, which was given a mandate in October of that year by the Security Cabinet in Israel to combat boycott, divestment, and sanctions activism wherever it existed in the world. And they did that in a number of different ways, including through overt means, but also through covert means, some of which we still don't know about because they are they remain state secrets. But much of it we have learned a lot about. And one of the ways that they did this was by partnering with like-minded organizations around the world, in the United States and Europe, to pursue some very specific objectives, including passing anti-BDS legislation, and also engaging in lawfare and smear campaigns to target dissenters in the United States and in Europe and elsewhere. And one of the sort of key components of these campaigns was to try to smear nonviolent activism as something that was inherently violent. And so they tried to connect it to terrorism, and they tried to connect it to anti-Semitism. And so they realized that, when they went about this, for example, through anti-BDS legislation, they ran into something called the First Amendment. And they realized that the First Amendment was a problem because political speech is protected, and you cannot direct law enforcement against political speech because we have these constitutional rights. And similar things exist in Europe as well, even though they're not always as robust as the First Amendment here in the United States. And so they decided that there has to be a way to do this by circumventing the First Amendment. And the way they went about this is by shifting to making this a conversation about anti-Semitism, because discrimination is not something that is protected by the First Amendment. And so if you can cast nonviolent dissent for Palestinian rights as anti-Semitism, you can then hijack the law enforcement apparatus of the state and direct it against the dissenters that you want to target. And so there has been this major effort in the last several years to redefine anti-Semitism in a way that includes Palestinian expressions for freedom, that includes calls for Palestinian refugees to return to their homes, that includes Palestinian calls for equal rights. Anything that challenges a Zionist interpretation to justice is considered anti-Semitism. And anything that opposes Zionism is considered anti-Semitism. And so, we've seen this effort develop over the last several years, and we are seeing it really now going into overdrive in this moment. I think one of the things that's also important to point out is, remarkably, and despite all of that, in a moment where we are seeing perhaps more intense repression targeting those who speak up for Palestine, we are seeing more people speaking up for the rights of Palestinians than ever. And so I think this really is a failed strategy. And more people are looking at it as sort of a desperate attempt to silence dissent than those that are really looking at it as some kind of good faith effort to combat anti-Semitism or extremism.
And what about what the ADL is doing and the Brandeis Center?
These are two organizations that have cooperated with the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs. They've participated in convenings put together by this ministry. There's a long trail of evidence of this, but they have long sought to try to use existing U.S. state law to target dissenters in the United States against Israeli policy. They've sought to do this by trying to stretch anti-terrorism law to apply it to BDS. They've done it by trying to stretch anti-discrimination law by tying it to BDS through claims of anti-Semitism. And now we're hearing the Anti-Defamation League and the Brandeis Center for Human Rights Policy. I'm not sure what the exact name is, but organizations that purport to be human rights organizations and civil liberties defenders, calling for mass terrorism investigations of college students. I mean, it's again, it would be laughable if it wasn't so dangerous. I think it's really despicable and a desperate effort to try to, catch a ship that's already sailed, to be honest with you.
Yeah, and of course, the ADL now considers Students for Justice in Palestine a hate group, and Jewish Voice for Peace a hate group. So we should know that when the ADL talk about trivializing anti-Semitism, when they talk about an increase in anti-Semitism and a certain number of incidents, I don't take them seriously at all, because for the ADL, a major act of anti-Semitism would be a protest calling for a ceasefire organized by Jewish Voice for Peace.
Well, and people should look at the ADL's data. I mean, one thing I will give the ADL credit for is that, if you look hard enough, you can actually find what goes into their data. They don't put this out on the front, but if you want to go look, you can see that they count in their anti-Semitic incidents anti-Israel rallies,
right?
Including rallies that are organized by Jewish groups. So look, there is an effort within significant parts of the establishment Jewish community to try to monopolize a definition of Jewish identity. And to make Jewish identity Zionist identity. And while there has long been dominant strains of Zionist identity within Jewish communities for parts of the last century, there's always been non-Zionist and anti-Zionist strains as well. And so I think the effort to do this is actually, causing a lot of people to push back against these organizations, reject their efforts, and also call into question what sort of commitments they really have to justice and to combating, any form of bigotry.
It's also an anti-Semitic trope, which is so ironic, because this idea that all Jews are a monolith who support Israel is something that raging anti-Semites put forward, and then AIPAC, the ADL, and the government of Israel put forward.
Yeah, I mean, no community is a monolith. No community all thinks alike, and the idea that they should be expected to, I think, is preposterous, and again goes against the values of anybody who is genuinely fighting against any form of bigotry,
And for lots of Jews, that's part of their identity.
including Jews who live in Israel, by the way.
Mm.
I mean, there's plenty of anti-Zionist Jews who live in Israel. I wouldn't say they represent the majority of Jews who
Right.
live in Israel, but even Israel understands, the government of Israel understands that there are anti-Zionist communities within Israel, and of course, the largest anti-Zionist community within Israel are Palestinians,
Right.
of which there are millions. And so again, all of this is sort of, I think it's actually aimed at a couple of things. Uh, One, it is a response to divisions within the American Jewish community over Israel policy. And it's an attempt to kind of discipline and corral the American Jewish community in a singular direction. And that is a response to many people increasingly questioning what Israel is doing to the Palestinians over the last 20 years or so, including within the Jewish community. But it's also an effort to try to silence Palestinians. Let's be clear. If you are saying that the only people who are really allowed to be part of respectable discourse are Zionists, then you are telling Palestinians either you negate your own existence by adopting Zionism, or you can't be part of any conversation about what should happen with you. And I think that's a fundamentally racist sort of position to take, and it's one that these groups take unapologetically,
Mm.
while claiming to also combat bigotry. It's bonkers.